IVM.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
It's been almost 2 years since Donald Trump was elected the President of the United States of America. We have seen what all he has done afterwards. But what has happened to the Washington, D.C. ecosystem since 2016? Soren Dayton joins us on the Pragati Podcast to tell us all about it.
Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We are your hosts, Hamsini, Hariharan,
and Pavan, Srinath.
This week on the show, we have Soren Dayton joining us to discuss what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Soren has spent over a decade working in Washington, D.C. in various roles, including for 2 years on Capitol Hill, assisting House Representative Nick Smith. Soren has also spent a year working in Bangalore and another 6 months in Delhi with the International Justice Mission.
Currently, he is the Director of Communications and Policy at Protect Democracy. Protect Democracy is a fascinating new initiative that is fighting back against the threats faced by the American democracy using constitutional means and the rule of law.
It goes without saying that Soren is here speaking to us on the Pragati Podcast in his personal capacity, and that his views don't reflect that of Protect Democracy.
We'll be back with Soren after this short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on IVM. Are you following us on social media yet? If not, you definitely should be. We're IVM Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Last week, we released a brand new show called Know Your Qanun with lawyer Amber Rana. This week, Amber talks about the laws and rights related to sexual harassment in public spaces. On the Kinetic Living Podcast, Urmi talks to none other than Rajesh Kumar, aka Rosesh from Sarabhai vs. Sarabhai, to talk about his fitness transformation. On Shunya One, we had an interesting conversation about all things money, insurance, and more with Mukesh Kalra from ET Money. On the Kolaba Cartel this week, Abhishek and Gauri talk to me about their philosophy of building and organizing a team. On The Seen and the Unseen, Amit Verma talks to the journalist and author Snigdha Poonam about her first book, Dreamers, which chronicles the aspirations of a young India. On the Pragati Podcast, Pavan and Hamsini decode the concept and the meaning of the term Swaraj with Professor Akash Singh Rathore. We have also released a new podcast called Woody Woodpecker with Rachel Lopez, where she deciphers a new word every week. I'm not revealing what this week's word was, so check it out to make sure. Also, guys, we are hiring a new producer, a social media intern, and a graphic designer. If anybody's interested, please apply to jobs@indusvox.com. And with that, continue with your show.
Welcome back. We are here with Soren Dayton to talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C. Hi, Soren. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you back in Bangalore as well. Mm-hmm. So, Soren, you've spent now quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C., both working on the Capitol Hill and adjacent to Capitol Hill, and you've also spent some time in India. Mm-hmm. How do you see how Washington, D.C. has changed since Trump became the president?
Well, in many ways, the most important story of the Trump era has been how Congress responds to Trump, because there you can see almost all of the dynamics around Trump by looking at what Congress is doing and whether it's in Congress's power or something like that. So the first question that many of us had, and I'm speaking as someone who has worked in Republican politics for 15 years, but who is not a Trump supporter, was would Republicans in Congress stand up to Donald Trump? And on what issues would they stand up to Donald Trump? And would there be an institutional response? Because there's been this 20 or more year slide of power from Congress to the executive that has undermined Congress's ability to do things as it sort of tried to hide from accountability.
So even Trump coming to power was on this premise that Washington is broken, they can't get anything done. Here's this outsider who will somehow magic his way into getting things done.
He will make deals. He will work with the other side, which interestingly is something everyone wants, even though when it comes to actually doing that, no one does. That is, the polling clearly shows that. But so he promised that. and he campaigned on that, but he has definitely not succeeded. And some of that is the polarization of the Democrats against Trump, and some of that is also Republicans sort of entirely conceding to Trump and giving up on Congress's institutional prerogatives that it is allegedly held as the first branch, the Article 1 branch that determines purse, etc.
So when you say that the Republicans sort of caved in to Trump, what all does that mean? One part of that is Congress, right? So there are currently you're saying that there are not too many Republican congressmen who are trying to oppose Trump's policies. Is that what it means?
Well, so, when you talk about Congress, you have to talk about each of the two houses separately. So in the U.S. House, there has been a set of people, the so-called Freedom Caucus, who are extremely pro-Trump. But more importantly, Republican base voters, the core people that nominate Republican candidates, are very pro-Trump. And so in many ways, increasingly, Republican members of the House are afraid of their shadows. They have to do what Trump wants because if they don't, their voters will punish them. In fact, the number one question is not where are you on this issue or where are you on that issue? It's where are you on Trump? Are you for Trump or are you against Trump? If you're against Trump, I'm going to vote against you. And so that's...
So in a sense, the vote against... So the vote, when say Americans are voting their representatives to Congress, even that has become a vote on Trump in a sense?
It is absolutely a vote on Trump right now in a Republican primary.
Okay.
And, which is the key question, because that's where, because of a variety of mechanisms, gerrymandering, the way we draw our districts, that is the key election for almost all congressional seats. There's maybe only 20 or 30 congressional seats across the whole country that are actually competitive in the November general election. So members of Congress live and die by their primary voters. In this case, primary voters are for Trump. Members of Congress have to be for Trump. So that's the House.
Okay.
Now, the Senate's a different story for two reasons. One is states are bigger. They're less, you can't gerrymander a state in the same way. So more of those are swing, but more importantly, they're also there for 6 years. And so there have been, there's less immediate accountability. House elects every 2 years, Senate every 6. But the only people who have really stood up to Trump have been people who are retiring. And, in this case, there's been a couple of things about sanctions on Iran, sanctions on Russia, where there's been attempts by the Senate to box Trump in, but there's been it hasn't been matched in the House, and it's almost never been sustained. So
okay, so you have the two houses of Congress where the Republicans are not challenging Trump, contesting Trump, sort of work with him to come up with something better, right? What about the party leadership, finance, all of that?
In general, the leadership of the party always owes its allegiance to a president when it happens. The president basically picks the leader and is the primary person involved in fundraising. But more importantly, in much the same way, the president's ability to raise money from small dollar donors, that is, people that are giving contributions online and things like that, has been a massive driver of the president's power over the party. Now, there's still, raising money from big interests and big millionaires and billionaires is important. But again, the president's ability to define the party around him. Trump has eaten Washington. He's eaten the Republican Party. He's eaten Congress. He's eaten the Democratic Party. He's eaten the media in so many different ways. And so there's really, on the Republican side, it's really just Trump's party increasingly. And that raises real questions about the future, especially with the 2018 election coming up.
Okay. Now, what about the other party, the Democrats? How have they responded to Trump?
So there's a couple of different factors. First, within the Democratic Party, opposition to Trump is the primary issue of the day, right? So just like in the Republican Party, the question is, are you against Trump? Are you for Trump? There's no issue that matters. The first question is, who's more against Trump? Now, the second question has become, and this is mostly washed out any constructive debate, right? Then the second question is, in some sense, a form of relitigating the 2016 primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Either are you for Bernie, or were you for Hillary, or are you taking some of Bernie's core issues? Like Medicare for all, that is expanding. There's part of the American healthcare system that is for elderly people that's entirely paid for by the government. And are you willing to expand that to the rest of the population? Or some issues involving immigration enforcement and things like that. But those are the issues that determine that. But again, the primary question is who's more against Trump? Who will do more to stop Trump?
Are you saying that there are no longer as many nuanced debates in DC as there were maybe even in the Obama administration about whether it's about abortion, whether it's about the various hot button topics, or also more run-of-the-mill things like how do you regulate Uber and Lyft? How do you, manage the telecom sector, the internet, net neutrality, other things? So all of those have taken a back seat today to just Trump.
So as you get more and more away from, political issues and closer to technocratic issues, it changes some. Well, first of all, the number of things that have become political issues is very high. So, the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates telecom policy, has had many issues in front of it that have been much more general interest than one would typically expect. So this has taken the form of, say, net neutrality, which has become a large public debate over the last couple of years, sort of reaching almost the level that it did here in 2014 and 2015. And Ajit Pai, who is the chairman of the commission, has become a sort of public figure in a strange way. The other thing that's been important for him has been the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, oversees mergers of media entities in some cases, and they just rejected a purchase of a number of local TV stations by a conservative broadcasting company, Sinclair. And so things like that have brought them more into focus. But as you get farther and farther away, some things continue as normal, but it's getting harder and harder for real attention to come to those issues because Trump has eaten the media cycle. And there's very, if it's not Trump, it gets almost no attention, which can be good for small technocratic policymaking or, rulemaking in particular. But there is less movement. There are fewer decision makers, et cetera, because of other issues.
Okay. What has happened to people working for the federal government? I know that in the US, unlike in India, there's a layer of political appointments, and then there is a sort of a more career bureaucracy type layer as well, right? Mm-hmm. How are they doing in the last few years?
So, first of all, you need to start with the political leadership in answering this question. And the political leadership is approximately 5,000 people
who
are appointed by the president to so-called political appointments. And those people have been nominated at a very slow rate. But, well, there's two categories, you should be clear. There's some that need to be approved by the Senate.
Okay.
Right? And that's a 50-vote test or 51-vote test.
So this includes what? Ambassadors? It includes
cabinet,
and
sub-cabinet officials, so as secretaries, assistant secretaries, et cetera. And then people at independent agencies. So, for example, we're talking about the Federal Communications Commission. Those people have to be approved. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Election Commission, et cetera. And number one, Trump has been appointing people at a very slow rate relative to the past. Number two, they've been getting approved by the Senate because Democrats have said, we're not going to let anything through. And so they use all their tools, and there are many in the Senate, to slow down. So that's the first part. That's the leadership. And this has meant that for a long time, there's been no one to take ultimately political decisions. Some decisions are purely are staff driven, but the big ones have to be driven by the political people. So again, no one to take decisions. Now, the second issue is that people are leaving the civil service and fewer people are joining. And this is meaning in some agencies, such as the Foreign Service, that they're shrinking quickly and losing an enormous amount of expertise. And this could be quite dangerous. There are possibilities of real, of government just stopping working. effectively. Now, it could very well be that we could survive with a much smaller government. Don't get me wrong. This is where I've been a Republican and I still am. But there are some things where there's real expertise, whether it's cybersecurity or intelligence or the Foreign Service or the census. We actually need people who know things. And it does not seem like we're getting them right now.
Right. And a government that becomes smaller by adverse selection of employees is not the best one, right? If you're most talented, and most talented people are also the most mobile. And if they're the first to leave, then you're left with those who have no other option. And you just get worse governance.
That's exactly right.
But why are people leaving? Do they think that just working with this government is not feasible? Are there other structural reasons for that?
Well, so there's a number of reasons. One is there was a big explosion in employment in the 70s, and many of those people are just hitting retirement. So you have this wave, and this is getting sort of very much in the weeds. You have a wave of retirement. Two, if you're highly skilled, compensation in outside of the government can be much higher. And so if you're nervous about the political environment and you're a lawyer and you're working with the government, you can go to a firm and double or triple your salary. If you're, if you know something about cybersecurity, I mentioned, and, have seen the real innards of the system, you can go work for a bank and probably make 4 or 5 times as much money. Okay. So there's real options for highly skilled people.
So it's sort of Trump coming into power is also coinciding with some sort of an economic recovery, right? Even if it's a little uncertain. I mean, unemployment numbers are at an all-time low. You have a lot of jobs being created in the US right now, right? I mean, I have no idea whether this will sustain for the next 5 years or so, but that's certainly happening over the last 2 years.
Right? It is absolutely the case. And there's a number of factors here. I mean, one, it should be said, is definitely the tax bill that was passed last year had some enormous stimulative provisions that have, they're just pumping money into the economy, makes capital investment much cheaper. And that has real, both long-term and short-term impacts. The flip side is that revenues are down massively. Deficits and debt are at all-time highs. And there could be some real scary consequences of that, but maybe not. To be fair, we've been saying things about the debt and deficit for years, and they've only sort of become true. Although, in the short term, we've seen treasury sales become more expensive and other things that are beginning to be some warning signs there.
Okay. And so now, I mean, we've still largely talked about the political apparatus, the government, the legislature. What about people outside of the government? How have think tanks, public affairs firms, I mean, 2 issues that Trump is big on are, one is sort of stopping immigration of various forms, restricting it. The second is sort of stopping free trade, right? I mean, tariffs on China, rethinking NAFTA, a lot of these. And these have enormous consequences for the private sector as well, right? So how are both think tanks and private businesses responding?
Well, so let me start with the private businesses, because the 2 examples you gave of immigration and trade are things where the president effectively can make most of the decisions himself, or the president in partnership with the cabinet agency, whether it's the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security in the case of immigration, or the Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative in the case of trade. And
so these are just executive orders, right?
Effectively, or rules or similar things, findings that there's, that cars from other countries are national security risks or something like that. It's essentially a report. There's a little process around it, but it's essentially an executive report. So, again, decision-making has been increasingly centralized in the president himself. These are not actions that these are actions that are effectively at the discretion of the president. So, how you impact the president has become harder and harder. There are personal relationships. There's lots of ads that run on Fox and Friends, which he clearly seems to watch in the morning. So it's really been in a frightening way, narrowed to a particular person, and the typical apparatus of influencing Congress, of influencing regulatory agencies, having public battles has really receded, and it's really become focused around this one man and his ego. Now the think tanks have had a little bit of it's affected that scene differently. The first one you have to talk about is the Heritage Foundation, which has been going through an enormous transformation over the last decade. But it really, because President Trump didn't have a transition plan, he was staffed at Heritage's recommendation in a really extraordinary way that we probably haven't seen before in history.
Wow.
And so they've really come to dominate, not just in a notion of ideas, and probably less in a notion of ideas, but in the staffing and the personnel. And there's a saying actually from an early board member of Heritage that personnel is policy in the end, and so they really are driving the policy agenda, just through different means.
Personnel is policy.
Personnel is policy. Yeah, it doesn't. Your ability to impact policy is dependent on, and I mean, this is the idea of the quote, is dependent on people who believe it, or, and your ability to stop policy is again dependent on people who don't believe it, right? That if there's a disconnect between the people actually executing the policy and the policy, ultimately the people will probably win, the people executing the policy will win over the stated policy.
Okay. So that's the Heritage Foundation. And of course, I mean, just as a backdrop of this, unlike think tanks in India, or at least think tanks in India as of a few years ago, most think tanks in the US are partisan, right? They either lean Republican or lean Democrat and have better working relationships with one of them. And perhaps the exception would be bipartisan think tanks. Is that characterization correct?
Yeah, there are a couple that represent more sort of maybe industry specific topics. Right. So just to use an example, ITIF, the Technology Innovation Foundation, I forget, right. There's a letter salad there. They are more probably pro tech sector perspective than they are left, right. Some of those ideas happen to be sort of anti-regulatory, but maybe supportive of some spending or something like that. But for the most part, it's purely, left-right agendas in some sense. And also the think tanks serve as sort of holding pens. So after the Obama administration, many of the think tanks got Obama staff.
Right.
And
so they'll be there for 4 years or 8 years till they get a chance to go back in.
Yeah. Yeah. And similarly, the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute have in the past housed many former Bush appointees, for example. So Elaine Chao, who is the transportation secretary and the wife of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, served as a senior fellow of high standing at the Heritage Foundation for 8 years. And then she went back into government.
Okay. So that was the Heritage Foundation. What about other think tanks?
In many ways, there's been a rise of smaller think tanks that are sort of more technocratically focused, like the R Street Institute, which does really phenomenal work on say tech policy or things like that. And they don't have either the overhead or the challenges implicit in, having all these old big names. They can focus on narrow issues rather than yesterday's political fights.
Okay. And they don't take on the big political hot potato topics either. All right.
Yeah. Insurance policy. No one cares about insurance policy except small sets of people, but those often have really fundamental importance.
Right.
Yeah.
So then how have other groups, how have businesses responded to these actions on trade and immigration? I would say both of them have a big impact, right? I mean, a lot of talent today is coming out of Asia, coming out of elsewhere. I mean, global trade is now so complex that you apply a tariff in one place, there are cascading effects everywhere. We've heard enough news about this, right? Mm-hmm. So this clearly probably hurts the bottom line for many, many businesses. What are they trying to do?
Well, so starting with the immigration issue, because in some ways that's been the clearest, many businesses came out against the president's travel ban or Muslim ban, or whichever language you want to use, his early executive order restricting entrance from certain countries, mostly Muslim majority countries. And so Microsoft participated in substantial legal action. Many Silicon Valley companies ensured that they would protect their employees who were impacted by this or by the repeal of some immigration provisions. And so they've been involved in sort of full scale revolt, whether it's, litigation to stop these actions or spending a lot of money to protect their staff or public engagement on these issues. Trade is more complicated because there are people on different sides of the issue. So, for example, on steel tariffs, there's people who use steel and there's people who make steel. And it seems like the people who make steel have been winning most of those fights, which is harming the economy because there's a lot more companies using steel, whether it's cars or other things. So that's been less of a clear place to engage, and there's been simply more questions. The one counterexample of that would be in agriculture, where people are already starting to hurt a lot. And agriculture, in many ways, the rural sectors being one of the core bases of the Republican Party, is creating real challenges for the party. And thus, the president has pledged a subsidy to people who are hurt by him raising taxes on them through tariffs and things like that.
Okay. So this is about agriculture, which is sort of export oriented, right? Is that what a lot of American agriculture is?
Much American agriculture. So probably 90% of our soybean crop is exported, enormous amount of our corn, a lot of chicken and beef and pork is for export. And then there's other sort of more refined, milk, some in Canada. We send a lot of milk to Canada, which has various restrictions on that, and dairy products all over the world. So yeah, in many ways, agriculture is one of our biggest export sectors. First in line is oil and chemicals that come from oil and things like that. But agriculture is both significant and it has enormous political consequence.
Okay. So this is both in the context of NAFTA and global trade, right?
Yeah.
Okay. This to me is very surprising because businesses traditionally have leaned Republican, right? So now will businesses who want freer trade, want easier immigration and so on start siding Democrat because the Republican party today is Trump? Then where else do companies turn to sort of further their interests?
So I would slightly reframe that because in many ways immigration and trade have different they act quite differently here. So immigration is ultimately about human capital, right? In attracting the best talent and breaking down barriers, whether it's national barriers or racial barriers or gender barriers or, whatever. So there's been a strong move in the highly human capital intensive industries, the tech sector, the creative sectors, to become increasingly more liberal, maybe in the big L liberal sense.
Right.
On all these sorts of issues. They're increasingly cosmopolitan, increasingly global, et cetera. The trade issue is a little different because the amount of goods shipped is in some sense decreasing. And so it gets a little more complicated as markets move. But I would say that the most important thing is probably the rise of human capital. There was a women's march the day after the president's inauguration, and a big advertising firm in New York paid for their entire staff, a big publicly traded advertising firm paid for their entire staff in New York to come down to the Women's March. That's extraordinary. I can't think of a time when that's happened, but they're doing it to attract talent. And that's a big shift.
Okay. Thanks, Soren. That was a great overview of various things that are happening in DC. But if we can take a step out of DC for now, what Trump seems to be doing is sort of redefining the question of what America is and who an American is, right? And we are seeing different strains of that in Turkey, in India, in the UK, and elsewhere. So in that context, what is the larger question that the Americans need to sort of figure out for themselves? I mean, there was this idea of the American dream where anyone can come from anywhere and sort of make it big there. There was this idea of American exceptionalism, which was about how they're special. There was also the dominant superpower America, and all those things are being contested now,
Yes.
right? So what's next for the US?
Well, so let me give some texture to that first, because I think once you see the components, that becomes especially clear. So income mobility has been falling since the 50s or 60s, number one. Number two, if you don't have a university degree, your income has been falling since the 70s. Whereas if you have a university degree or a graduate degree, you're doing well, right? So in some sense, number one, we're going to have to need to redefine our social contract, because there are many people for whom the American dream seems to be inaccessible.
Right.
And that's a deep challenge, and that's a deep challenge made worse by globalization and technology, right? If you're, increasingly people are no longer doing manufacturing, they're doing service work. Service work is lower skilled, lower productivity. How are we going to give these people skills and a sense of meaning to live? Because, the suicide rates have been going up, drug addiction, et cetera, that are creating real serious challenges. So one, meaning, social contract, problem one. Problem two is there's this large demographic change. America is going to become, for the first time in its history, a majority non-white. And that's driven by Latino immigration. It's driven by Asian immigration, but it's also driven by people being born in the United States. And, we mentioned Ajit Pai from the
FCC.
From the FCC. And, his parents moved to Kansas. They were doctors from, I think they're Konkan or Mangalore or something like that. And, they moved as doctors, and now he's an American. And there's many of those stories. So this change in who America looks like and who it's connected to. 50 years ago, it was clearly connected to Europe. More recently, Latin America, increasingly with India and China being the two largest sources of immigrants, it's Asia. And America is going to struggle with this question of who it is. And Trump has, in some sense, part of making America great again seems to be thinking back to those times when it was great for certain people. And, not to put too fine a point on it, certain white people. And that's a real interesting change that as a country we have to respond to. And that immigration is a source of dynamism. We're really the only Western country that's got a growing population. And it's partially because of birth rates there's both immigration and birth rates due to recent immigrants. So, that's a very tense issue. And then the third thing is a question of who America is in the world. And this matters less as a vote moving issue because, this is at the level of storytelling, but it's profoundly important in how you mobilize people. Right. And certainly since World War II, America has had a story about itself that puts itself at the center of the world. And, it saved Europe from fascism. It did all these things. And with the rise of China and, to a lesser extent, India and other places, America doesn't have the self-confidence. When I listen to Trump, I hear a lack of confidence in America. And until we figure out a way to place ourselves in relationship to the rest of the world that solves these questions raised by technology or globalization, I think we're not going to have a complete package here. We're not going to find a way to have a stable politics. And, that could take 10 years. That could take 15 years. All the while, I fully expect, incredible innovation. Many of these enormous companies like Apple will continue to do things, although their markets won't necessarily be, their primary markets will become less and less the United States and more, China or India or other places. But that's going to have a real impact on the American psyche. And until politicians can figure out how to tie these together, as I say, we'll be struggling.
Thank you, Soren. Thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast.
Thank you for having me. Great to be back in Bangalore with you.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions for Soren or for us, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com.
Visit our website at thinkpragati.com for your daily dose of brain fodder on all things public policy.
You can subscribe to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever else you get your podcasts from. We're there everywhere.
Hi, I'm Vishal Gondal, an entrepreneur. I've had the chance to meet and understand how some of the super achievers have hacked their way to success, and they have done spectacular innovations. Now I take a closer look at these people's lives to find out what lies beneath the force, only on the Vishal Gondal Show. Episodes out fortnightly on Wednesdays on the IVM website, app, or your favorite podcasting platform.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that the insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to The Seen and the Unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.